So, welcome everybody to our last lecture for the semester. Wow, is that me or did that go quite fast? Or did it go sort of slow, fast, slow, fast?
Painfully fast?
Painfully fast. Ah, well, that's because we started in February. Let's not do that again. That sort of threw me right off. All right, guys. Well, this is our last one, and we're just going to finish up with the last chapter. So, end of semester countdown. Today is your last lecture class, and at the end of this class, I'm also going to give you information on a survey that Dr. Hurtado has put together that he would like you, what we would like you to do about cultural knowledge. It's basically just asks you questions about cross-cultural things. I did it already and it took me like 5 minutes, so it's really teeny tiny. And then I also have some PowerPoints to show you about your evaluations, which the Provost's office is pushing very hard to the point where I have 3 slides I'm going to show you today on how to do them. And I'm going to ask the people that are here if they have mobile devices, if they will stay and do them on their mobile devices if they can, because we're really being pushed to ask you to do it. So we're going to finish early and I'll ask you to do it. Next week, I'll also send through a reminder to our online people to complete those. And there's a reminder that your paper is due on May 10th. And although I won't see you, I'll be available obviously by email or virtual office throughout that time. I haven't seen anything on the virtual office, so I assume everybody out there is doing okay with their papers. How are we doing in here? Good?
Looking forward to it.
Looking forward to it.
I was finishing my 595 last week.
Ah, right. Yeah, I know. I have several people finishing their 595.
So that's done, so.
Great, great. Diego, how's yours going?
It's coming.
It's coming along.
It'll be there.
It'll be there, okay. And Tolalupe?
I'm working on it.
You're working on it, good? All right. All right, well, if you need to contact me, don't hesitate. I'll be around. Okay, so we're just going to finish up the content work, and I've sort of redone this slide again, that if we sort of want to add up what we've been doing, you know, we've looked at these internal factors, special nativism, general cognition, information processing. Then we looked at non-language factors like anxiety and personality. And then last week we looked at sociocultural factors, so outside of the mind. And then today we're going to finish up with instructed SLA. Okay. So what do we mean by instructed SLA? It's a pretty sort of small part of some people's language learning experience. So some of you are simultaneous bilingual, so you learn 2 languages at the same time. Some of you, I mean everybody out there too. Some of you are sequential bilinguals. That would be you, correct, Diego? So sequential bilinguals can either learn it at home or under instructions or part and part. So what were you, Diego? Just in instruction or part?
It was instruction.
Just in instruction, right?
That's
Okay.
what Spanish at home.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Everybody else is essentially an L2 learner. Now, there's more divisions as we go on. People are trying to make more finer distinctions because of people's experiences. But right now, in general, we're L2 learners who, if we're not naturalistic learners, meaning that you're dumped inside a country. So like me in Hungary, I was a naturalistic learner. I never went to school in Hungary and I just had to learn. I don't know if you'd learned any Spanish before you went.
No.
Not really, yeah. So you would be too. So, but adult language learners spend most, if not all their time of language learning in the classroom. So that would be learners who were learning Spanish or French in middle or high school. The only in between group that we recognize quite strongly now is what we call the heritage language learning group, because, and in fact so much so that here in Spanish under Flavia and Inma, I think we have special classes now. And the heritage language learning group are people who may have grown up speaking English in their home because they grew up in America, so speaking English in their home, or speaking English at school, or speaking partially Spanish or English at home, but then doing all their education in English at school. So this is a different kind of learner from an adult language learner that comes in, and typically in Texas it's Spanish. But everything that you're about to see in terms of research here is your standard, what we would call bog standard L2 adult learner. So somebody that comes into the classroom with nothing. So standard adult language learner who's learned a second language primarily through classroom instruction, and what we know about what that kind of instruction can and can't offer is very much research based. Okay, so I was just telling Mark and Diego Tolalupe that I was listening to the BBC World Service as I was driving here, and they were just about later in this hour to do a article, to do a piece on the radio on a new study coming out of psychology that apparently says you're banging your head against a wall if you're trying to learn grammar past the age of 10. So I have no idea what this study is. I just tried to upload it, but because it's actually on air at the moment, I can't do that. So I'll have a look. But that's just to say that, as you know from this whole class, all this research is constantly updating and ongoing. So there's a lot of recycling of ideas in this one. You're going to hear and look at some terms that you've met before, like morpheme order studies and accessibility hierarchy, noticing hypotheses, as what a lot of this research is about taking those ideas and seeing what happens if you apply them to classroom language learning. So we'll check that you remember what those are. So the book begins by addressing the kind of language that occurs inside a classroom. I need to grab my book, which is of course different from the kind of language that occurs outside the classroom. So if we have a look at page 399, the way they do this, obviously you start by proficiency, which is beginner, upper beginner, intermediate, advanced. Baseline means native speaker. And what you're looking at is T units. And T units is a measure of operationalizing quality of language that has come from L1 and second language child studies. And a T unit is one main clause with any subordinate clause that's attached to it. Okay, so it might be just one main clause, or it might be a main clause plus a subordinate clause. That would be a single T unit, right? So what you see is if you've got beginner levels, they've got 4.3 words per T unit. So that's a pretty little T unit, right? That would be something like, how are you, John? Or something like that, right? And then by the time you get to be an advanced learner, you've got 8.26 words inside an average T unit, okay? So that's how much development a learner will have. Ratio of clauses per T unit. So that means how many main clauses and subordinate clauses. So basically a beginner has almost entirely a main clause, right? Because it's 1.02. And by the time you get to advanced, they have 1.38. So still a lot of single clauses, but now a lot more subordinate clauses attached. Okay. And words per clause also goes up, right? You've got, if you look at the beginner from words per T unit, which is just a single main clause, to now you've got words per clause. So this might be main plus subordinate. And you go down to 5.98 per clause. So you can see how much closer the learner comes to a baseline, to a native speaker unit, right? But still slower, still less complex, but much closer. So the other part, that's right, the other part is that constantly comes up with instructed learning is, if I let my students talk to each other, are they going to copy each other's mistakes, right? So the next part of your book suggests, has a look at the research that suggests that they don't pass on errors between. So this was the big thing between moving from a non-communicative to a communicative framework, right? Because non-communicative means teacher-centered. So teacher-centered, give me an idea of what teaching methods would have a teacher-centered approach. What can you dredge up from your TESOL 1 or TESOL 2?
Grammar translation.
Good. Grammar translation. What else?
The silent method.
That's interesting, because it is and it isn't, right? Because
First it is.
yeah, you're supposed to look at, but you're supposed to produce your own language, right?
Right.
So by teacher-centered, I mean language that the teacher, what's the big one? Yes, good. Audiolingual, Sheehan, that's right. So audiolingual is the big one, right? Where you're not supposed to say anything unless I say it first, in case you have a bad habit, right? So there was a lot, because we basically went from a lot of audiolingual and jumped over to communicative. A lot of teachers were concerned that if I then take myself out of the picture and have Diego and Mark talk together in pair work, that all they're going to do is start transferring their own errors backwards and forwards, right? So consistently, research has told us that they don't tend to do this unless there's no other input whatsoever. So if, for example, this is another argument if you're doing something like study abroad, it's another argument for why you want to combine immersion activities with some kind of structured learning, right? If there's another input other than you talking to people that might be talking back to you in foreigner talk, okay? So you just did this in data analysis 3, right? So there's no guarantee that when you're in an immersion activity, meaning you're talking to a native speaker of that language, they're producing correct language, right? You had in data analysis 3, you had a real good example of what foreigner talk could look like, right? Which is basically just repeating or confirming even, because that was naturalistic data. That wasn't, most of you got that, a couple of you missed that. It wasn't classroom data, it was naturalistic data. So there's no guarantee in those environments that you're going to get the structured ideas that you need to complexify the system, right? It's also the most important reason why with communicative activities, you need to give feedback to your students. You can't just do a communicative activity and then say, thank you very much, everybody, and everybody leaves. You know, the idea is you're supposed to be going around listening to what particular errors there might be that are across the classroom, and then spend some time giving that kind of feedback to your students. If there is no other input whatsoever, literally you're just on your own, you are likely to pigeonize. And this is an experience, I always look at Mark because this is an experience that Mark and I both had, me in Hungary and you in Mexico, right? There's no question that I ended up pigeonizing. Not that anyone ever knew because no one else could speak Hungarian. So when they said you need to take a Hungarian exam, I said, no, I think it's fine. And everyone was like, oh, well, that's good because no one can speak it anyway, so we don't know how you would have done the exam. So I'm sure for that there's a special place for me and for telling that white lie. Okay, so another issue that comes up with instructed learning, and this is something that's very dear to my heart actually, is teachability and learnability. So we'll start by what your book talks about, which is there any support to show that you should teach one thing before you teach another thing? Now, what was that called? What were some of the different ways that you saw that addressed in previous chapters? What did Krashen have to say about that?
It's N+1. I forgot what it's called.
Right. Well, no, that's good. That's the input hypothesis, I+1. But where did he say the +1?
The input is difficult enough to be challenging, but not so
Yes,
far
that's
beyond you that it's meaningless.
correct. But how do you, now that's the meaningfulness of the input, that's sort of proximal development, right? That's Vygotsky, who was focused on the meaningfulness. But Krashen was using something else. It was another one of his little hypotheses. And it's sort of up on the board. The what? No. Try harder.
Monitoring?
No. No, but we've nearly done with them. If you've got effective, that's the fourth one. So you've only got this one left. Morpheme order hypothesis. Do you guys remember that?
That wasn't his theory, was it?
That was what?
That wasn't his theory.
Well, but that's part of his hypotheses. That's his fifth one. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. What did you? But you're right. It wasn't his. Who did he take it from? Where did he get it from? Yes. Yes. I'll look at Diego now. He's like, hey, I've been done. I knew what that was. Yes. That came from Brown, right? That was the idea that you had to learn grammatical morphemes like plural and so on in a certain order, right? But Krashen took that. He grabbed that and said that was one way that you could operationalize I+1, right? So who remembers what the accessibility hierarchy was? That was Pianeman, the guy from Australia. Nothing. Do you remember it was the idea that you can't learn, if you take something like relative clauses or negation, you can't go from stage 1 to stage 3. You go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4. So if you know relative clauses, subject relative clauses, that's stage 1, right? But if you know indirect object relative clauses, it assumes that you know all the other stuff as well, right? The same with negation. If you're saying I know C, or I know, we assume you're on stage 1. But if you're being able to say things like I can't go, then we assume, unless of course it's a frozen form, you've just taken it as an unanalyzed form. basically, if you got that far with negation, we think you can do all the early stages of negation. Does that ring any bells? Sort of. Okay. So basically, that's the idea of teachability and learnability that your book takes you through, which is, you know, is there an order in which you should be taught things in order for you to learn things? And if they're approached in a different way, in a different order, you won't actually be able to learn them, right? So this is all related to the idea of complexifying the structure inside your head. There isn't really much that's conclusive there, to be honest, because if you take a small part like morpheme order or relative clauses, it's sort of difficult to say what else might be going on. So, for example, if you're testing someone and a group of learners and they don't use a certain form, one possibility is they might not be ready to learn it. But what's another possibility?
Avoidance.
Yeah, avoidance, absolutely, that they don't want to use it. They sort of think they know it, but they're not sure. So they try and use another form to do the same thing. So it's very difficult to pinpoint that. It also means that you have to get over all the problems that we showed that there were with the morpheme order studies, right? You remember the bilingual syntax measure, the little cartoons with the houses, and how there was, you did in your midterm that there was a lot of criticism about this kind of thing. So it is sort of assumes a lot about how much you can actually apply to that. Before we go on to noticing, there's another area of teachability and learnability, which is, are there things in the language that are not teachable or learnable inside the classroom? Meaning you can only acquire them naturalistically or through practice, like in a naturalistic setting. So is there anything anyone can think of that might fall under that?
Slang is one of those things.
Slang, right. So idiomatic language could be one. Is it possible to learn idioms? And many, you know, many teachers don't bother, you know, buying an idiom book and saying learn, you know, a group of idioms at a time, because what's the point? You know, they're so contextually based that it's tricky. What else might be?
I don't know, because I mean, it seems like if you were determined to produce something in a classroom setting, that you could. I mean, you could introduce slang, you could introduce pragmatics, including situations that you wouldn't normally try to present in a classroom, but I mean, if you really wanted to.
Yeah. So that's exactly my argument against everybody for the last 20 years that I've been doing this, that says you can't teach intonation in the classroom. Okay. So this is a big one, that you can't teach intonation in the classroom. That intonation is too tacit, and that if you, the only way you can do it is through experience in naturalistic settings. So I think I've talked to you guys before about Shige's project. He's actually proving that that's not true on a couple of different levels. Has proven, in fact, has shown that that's not true. It's also the case that in the last 10 years or so, there's been an increasing amount of research that shows that intonation as a system is both teachable and learnable in the classroom. And to the point where if you're in my sound systems class next semester or in the summer, I have a chapter in the book I've written for Michigan that's coming out this year that is specifically about this. And the reason I put a whole chapter in there was to say, look, we've got to get over this fact that some things are not teachable or learnable in the classroom, because the research does not support that. It supports that you can do teaching. On the flip side, what Shige, my student, has shown is that some aspects of something like intonation are not acquired naturalistically. Thus, you probably should teach them in the classroom. So have I told you what Shige found? The affective functions of intonation? No. So he found that he had 3 groups of learners. Learners that had been in Japan only learning English, learners that had been in America for 2 years approximately learning English, and learners, Japanese speakers that had been in America for 10 years or more. So they've been living here for 10 years or more, and they live and work in the States. And what he found was that one aspect of intonation, specifically affective intonation, so the intonation that you use if you like something or you don't like something. So you might say bread, and that means you like it, right? Or you might say raisins, and that means you don't like it, right? So this is how they test it. And what they found, what Shige found, was that none of the groups of learners could do it. So the native speakers got absolutely 100% right. Every time they could say, yes, they liked it, no, they didn't like it, yes, they liked it, no, they didn't like it. That was the one thing that none of the Japanese groups could do. They were all significantly together and significantly apart from the native speakers. So even the speakers that were living here, working here, and have been here over 10 years couldn't do that. They got that significantly incorrect. So that was great for me. Not so great for them, I guess, but great for me, because I've always said that this is probably true, that you can't guarantee that just because you're out and about that you're going to learn all these things, right? So it turns out that that would be a part of intonation that they would be better off in the classroom. Diego's looking.
Would you then say that in this situation, foreigner talk would be very beneficial? Instead of saying something with an intonation, we should say, I would like raisins.
Yeah, right. I mean, certainly foreigner talk, well, a lot of people will use foreigner talk plus paralinguistic signals, right? So, you know, like, ugh, raisins, right? You know, so you know that they hate raisins, right? The issue, the real issue for that finding that's problematic is it means that workers, Japanese speakers of English who are working here, who've been here for a very long time, might be pissing people off because they're saying things that they don't realize have an affective function. So that people are assuming that they mean something that they don't mean when they say something in a certain way. And vice versa, that somebody could be trying to tell them something, like they're trying to communicate the message through the intonation, this is not good, and this is being completely bypassed by the speakers who have no idea that that's the message that's being communicated, right? So this could be seriously problematic. And as I spend some of my time, quite a lot of my time looking at research into a lack of promotion, and so on, the sort of linguistic factors that can cause problems in the workplace. And one thing that we know is that non-native speakers are under-promoted. If you bring in a set of non-native speakers and native speakers at a certain level, that gets to a certain point where a lot of non-native speakers end up hitting a ceiling, regardless of initial evaluation of skills and so on. And I've always thought that this could be part of it. That part of it is that they're either incorrectly getting messages or incorrectly giving messages that are then causing them to be evaluated negatively. And that this could be, now this is, we're now talking about what I think, you know, as opposed to, but certainly that's a piece of the puzzle for me. If you can say that you have these people that have been here for this long and still can't make that judgment, but every single native speaker can make that judgment in a second, that suggests to me that that's quite significant, you know. So yeah, that was interesting. So teachability and learnability can be looked at from several different perspectives. Your book really focuses entirely on this idea of ordering of issues, accessibility and so on, but there's also the idea of, are there things that you can't really learn inside a classroom? And I'm with Mark here, basically. I mean, I think, you know, you can learn anything inside a classroom. Not only can you, there are things that we assume that you should learn outside, or that you will learn outside that you won't. Thus, we should be bringing it into the classroom, right? One issue that's probably particularly significant here is this idea, particularly for adult language learners, is this idea of the noticing hypothesis. Who remembers what the noticing hypothesis was? You're really good with names, Diego. Do you remember who did this one? This was the guy that just died. Schmidt? Yeah, this was Schmidt. So who remembers, just in general terms, if you can't even remember really, it's sort of in the name.
One of which is flex.
It's what? No, but that's not bad guess. Noticing hypothesis is the one where we say adult learners are probably not going to learn something unless they quote unquote notice it. So you have to do it through input enhancement, or by creating an activity in such a way that they notice the difference in their production and the real system, you know, the system that they're trying to learn. So in other words, it's not necessarily that you've got something that should or shouldn't be taught in the classroom. It's more of, it's the way you teach it in the classroom. So how do you get people to notice? You just did a little exercise where you looked at the different kinds of ways that you got feedback, and you gave me some examples. So this was one of them, right? For adults, recasts are a good way. Who remembers what a recast? We just did this, so please tell me you remember. Who remembers what a recast was?
It's almost the same as repetition, but it gets reworded.
Right. So,
Right.
yeah, into the correct version. Good. So I say, I stay my friend's house, and my teacher says, oh, you stay at your friend's house, you know, and there's hopefully the learner picks up the idea that they need that little preposition in there, right? And what we know is that adults do that way better than kids do. Like, adults actually respond to recasts. And there was also all the other kinds of things. So the important thing being not so much whether you choose what order things come in or so on, but that if you give the right kind of feedback, you will increase the chances of the learners learning this form, right? So Michael Long came up with this, and I really don't understand why he couldn't come up with anything better. But basically, it's the difference between focus on form and focus on forms. And this was in your chapter. Focus on form means it's meaning and communication-based focus. Focus on forms means that you're focusing your feedback on individual grammatical items, right? So a focus on forms would be the one where you would try and get somebody to add that third person S, right? For example, so he loved her, and you might use any kind of feedback like you know, so you have them fill in the gap, or you do a recast. He loves her with a recast or whatever. That is a focus on forms, okay, meaning the grammatical forms. Focus on form is really, I guess, what the guy was doing in the data set that you just did, where he's just focused on the meaning-based thing, and he says, yes, everything's good, you know, meaning that he understands what the communication is, right? So there's some evidence to suggest that it's better if you separate these out. So you start with focusing on meaning, and then once the learner has got the general idea, then you can work explicitly on things like missing third person S's and so on. This sort of makes sense to me because it's sort of what we do, right? Spend your time working out where you're going, what your organization is, and then go through at the end and make sure that you've got all the little bits and pieces, right? But it also depends, the research suggests it also depends on proficiency. Like lower level learners don't seem to do as well with an explicit focus on forms, meaning, you know, if you explicitly say to them, he loves, you say you love, like you might not get the idea that he or she is supposed to say loves, right? Whereas high proficiency learners and adults seem to do much better with that, with recasting correct forms, so that there's a level on which they are listening for both the meaning and the form. And in general, your book comes to the conclusion as to, and I would entirely agree, that rehearsal and planning. So planning speech, rehearsal of speech, meaning private rehearsal, the things that Vygotsky was talking about, private speech, where you rehearse it to yourself and so on, that will improve overall performance. The more you can sort of do that, the more you can kind of practice, even if it's to yourself, the better it is. Any questions on that?